The huntress descended through the thick canopy of trees, her glowing eyes scanning the dense jungle below. The air was humid, with the scent of wet earth and strange flowers. The ground was alive with the hum of creatures that flitted through the underbrush. Her footsteps were silent, her presence unnoticed. Yet, she was ever watchful, her sharp senses attuned to every flicker of movement, the wind carrying the faintest hint of her prey's scent. A human male was alone in this vast and dangerous world. He had been here for days after his ship had crashed. Scattered wreckage lay hidden beneath the vines, and leaves. The human had been injured, but his survival instincts were strong. She had been tracking him ever since the crash, the thrill of the hunt already taking root in her chest. The human would be no different from any other prey she had taken in the past. Her kind were hunters bred for this very purpose, and no one ever escaped them. But this one had caught her interest. Something about him was different, something that tugged at her curiosity. She could hear his movements ahead of her, the slight crunch of leaves underfoot, the rustle of branches. He was attempting to cover his tracks. She knew this game well. His efforts were futile, for her skills were unmatched. She could track him from miles away, her senses sharper than any creature in the jungle. She watched as he paused to check his surroundings, peering through the dense foliage before continuing on his way. He did not know she was already there, inches away. His time was running out. The huntress moved closer, her body flowing like water through the jungle, her movements graceful and precise. She felt the rush of adrenaline, the anticipation of the kill building inside her. But as she neared him, something unexpected happened. The human stopped his steps and turned his head, as if he had sensed her presence. His gaze scanned the trees, his eyes locking for a brief moment onto hers, his expression unreadable, before he swiftly turned and vanished deeper into the jungle. A rush of frustration surged through her. She had underestimated him, but this was just the beginning. The hunt was still hers to win. She pursued him relentlessly, the jungle no longer a sanctuary, but a battlefield where every step she took led her closer to her prey. The human was smart. He had set traps and false trails to mislead her. But the huntress was patient. She would not be outwitted. She could feel the excitement of the chase coursing through her veins. As she tracked him further into the unknown, the jungle grew thicker, the trees taller and more imposing, the air heavy with the sound of distant roars and rustling leaves. The huntress pressed on undeterred, the scent of the human growing stronger, the hunt becoming more exhilarating by the second. The human was starting to tire. She could tell by the way he was moving more cautiously now, his earlier confidence giving way to exhaustion. But he was still relentless. He had no intention of giving up, and that only made the huntress more determined. She wanted to see how far he would go before he collapsed, before he became the prey she knew he would eventually become. She could hear his labored breathing echoing through the trees, the unmistakable sign that he was nearing his breaking point. But she was patient. There was no need to rush. She knew he would make a mistake, and when he did, she would be there to strike. For hours the huntress tracked him through the endless jungle, her focus unbroken. She could feel the sweat trickling down her back, but it only spurred her on, the thrill of the chase, her mind sharp, every sense heightened, every step calculated. She was getting closer now. The human was running out of options, and she could already taste the victory. But something in her gut told her this was not going to be as easy as it seemed. She had encountered many prey before, but none like this one, none that had fought so hard, so smart, so fiercely. The huntress stopped for a moment, her senses tingling as a subtle shift in the air told her the human had done something unexpected. She moved quickly, taking cover behind a large rock, and waited, listening intently for any sound of movement. The jungle was still now, too still. And then it came, a distant sound of cracking branches, followed by the unmistakable hiss of a trap snapping shut. She smiled. The human had finally made his first mistake. He had stepped into one of his own traps, a minor error, but enough to give her the advantage now. It was time to end the chase. But when she moved forward cautiously to where she had heard the trap, she froze. Her heart skipped a beat. The human was gone. The huntress stood motionless in the shadows, her mind racing as she scanned the area where the human had been moments ago. The trap lay open and empty, the tension in the air thickening with every passing second. She had been sure of her victory, yet now she found herself questioning everything. Had the human outsmarted her? Had he planned this moment? Or was he simply lucky the jungle seemed to laugh at her confusion, the wind carrying the faintest trace of his scent off in the distance? But it was already fading, and she knew he was moving fast again. She crouched low to the ground, her sharp senses on high alert. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig, was now a signal to her. Her prey was close but elusive. He was no longer running in a straight line, but weaving through the trees, making his movements unpredictable. His understanding of the jungle was more profound than she had first believed. He knew it in ways that were almost instinctual. This human was more than just a frightened survivor. He was a cunning adversary, and the Huntress felt a thrill deep in her chest. It had been a long time since she had faced such a worthy challenge. The Huntress moved forward, her body moving like a shadow through the undergrowth, her eyes scanning every inch of the jungle ahead of her, her mind focused only on one thing: finding him, catching him. But with each passing moment, she could feel the pressure mounting. The chase was no longer simple. It was a battle of wits, a test of endurance and skill. She had underestimated him before, but now she knew better. She would not let her arrogance blind her again. She would win, but she had to be smarter than she had been. She tracked his scent through the thick foliage, the pungent smell of sweat and blood mingling with the rich earthiness of the jungle. It was faint, but there was no mistaking it. He was close. The Huntress grinned, her muscles coiling with anticipation. But then something strange happened. The air shifted, and her senses were flooded with a new sound, the unmistakable thud of feet landing softly on the ground behind her. She spun around quickly, but found nothing, her heart racing, her eyes darting in every direction. There was no sign of him. The wind shifted again, and she felt it too late, a weight pressing against her back, a sudden force that knocked her forward into the dirt. The jungle around her seemed to explode into motion as she twisted to face her assailant, but found nothing, only the shadow of a figure disappearing between the trees. The human had outmaneuvered her yet again. The moment of surprise had been his weapon, and now he was gone. She rose slowly, her body tense, every muscle alert. The hunt had taken a dangerous turn. She had been bested once more, and now she knew it was no longer a matter of catching him. It was a matter of survival. The human had turned the tables, and for the first time in a long, while the Huntress felt the sting of doubt in her mind, could she truly outlast him? Could she truly claim victory over someone who seemed to be always one step ahead? Her frustration mounted as she scanned the jungle again. There was no sign of him. His scent had disappeared, as if he had evaporated into the very air around her. The jungle seemed endless, now each tree an obstacle, each sound a potential trick, designed to keep her on edge. She knew he was watching her, somewhere out there in the jungle, his eyes following her every move, studying her weaknesses, and waiting for the right moment to strike. She had trained for this her entire life, trained to be faster, smarter, and stronger than anything that dared to cross her path. Yet this human was proving to be an enigma unlike any she had ever encountered. He moved with a precision that rivaled her own, but with an unpredictability that kept her guessing. She was being forced to play by his rules, and the realization stung deeper than any wound could. The Huntress clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms, the jungle around her alive with the hum of distant creatures, as if mocking her struggle. Yet she refused to give in. She had come too far. She was too close. She would not let this human escape her grasp. No matter how clever or skilled, he was still just a human, and she was a predator, a force of nature. But as she listened to the silence of the jungle and felt the weight of her growing weariness, she wondered for the first time in her life if this hunt might not be hers to win after all. The Huntress moved deeper into the jungle, her mind whirling with thoughts of her prey. She had never been this unsure before. The human had made it clear that he was no ordinary victim, and each step she took seemed to bring her further into his game. The sense of control she had always held was slipping away, her every move calculated, but still imperfect. She could feel his presence, now closer than ever, but just out of reach. The jungle seemed to be a living entity guiding him and pulling her into a maze she could not escape. Her senses were screaming at her, warning her that something was wrong. She paused, listening to the faintest rustle of leaves above her, but when she looked up, there was nothing, just the shadows of the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Yet she could feel it, the weight of his eyes upon her, a sensation that sent a chill down her spine. The human was here somewhere, watching, waiting to make his move, but she couldn't see him, couldn't catch him, not yet. The huntress crouched low, her body tensing. As she tried to listen for any sign of movement around her, the jungle was silent for a moment, and then the slightest sound broke through the stillness, the snap of a twig beneath a heavy footfall. Her heart raced as she turned sharply in the direction of the sound. But there was nothing. She had been tricked again. The human had made another move, and she had missed it. Her pulse quickened, her breath shallow, as she scanned the area. Every movement, every sound, seemed to be a potential trap, designed to mislead her. She couldn't afford to make another mistake. If she let her guard down, even for a second, he would slip through her fingers again. And that was something she could not allow. Her pride was on the line. But more than that, her reputation as a hunter was at stake. She could not be bested by a human. She would not let it happen. But the deeper she went into the jungle, the more difficult it became to track him. The terrain was growing more treacherous, the trees towering above her, blocking out the sunlight, the ground soft and uneven, her footfalls heavier with each step. And yet the human's trail seemed to be getting fresher, more distinct. He was moving faster now, and his movements were almost fluid, as if he knew the jungle better than she ever could. Her frustration began to build again, her confidence shaken. She had to catch him soon or risk losing him entirely. The huntress gritted her teeth and pressed on the jungle, now closing in around her. As she maneuvered it through the dense underbrush, every sense straining as she searched for the human's next move. But the jungle had a way of hiding things from her, and in the moment she least expected it, she heard it, a sudden rustling from behind her. She spun quickly, but once again there was nothing. Her pulse thudded in her ears, and she felt the familiar sensation of being hunted. She realized then, with growing unease, that the human was turning the tables on her. He wasn't just running anymore, he was toying with her, playing with her mind. Her heart hammered in her chest as she darted in the direction of the sound. This time, she would catch him. She couldn't afford to lose him again. Her hand gripped the hilt of her weapon. But as she burst through the dense foliage, she froze. The jungle lay quiet before her, no sign of movement, just the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. But then she saw it, the faintest glint of metal in the distance, a glimmer that caught her attention. She stepped closer cautiously, her instincts warning her that something was not right. The ground beneath her shifted suddenly, and without warning, she felt the earth give way beneath her feet. A sudden drop, as the jungle seemed to swallow her whole. She crashed into a pit hidden beneath the leaves, the impact jarring her body. As the world spun around her, she cursed under her breath, her mind racing. But before she could react, the human's figure appeared above her, silhouetted against the dim light filtering through the canopy. He had trapped her once more, and as the realization hit her, she knew this was no coincidence. He had set this trap for her, planned it with a precision that was almost terrifying. She could hear his voice, then low and taunting from above, calling down to her, not with malice, but with a strange sense of amusement, as if he knew he had won again. The huntress seethed with anger, her muscles burning, as she struggled to free herself, but the pit was deep, and the walls slick with mud. She couldn't climb out. She had been bested again. But this time it felt different. It was not just a defeat. It was a lesson, a reminder that no matter how skilled she was still just one hunter, and this human was no ordinary prey. The huntress sat at the bottom of the pit, her chest rising and falling with each labored breath. The walls of the pit were smooth and steep, too slick for her to climb. She could feel the sting of humiliation creeping into her chest, the anger bubbling beneath her skin. She had been caught in her own game. She had underestimated him. Again, the human had outwitted her, and now she was trapped beneath the earth, like a common prey. Her pride shattered in that moment. For a long while she lay there in the darkness, the sounds of the jungle echoing around her, the calls of creatures distant and foreign, only adding to her frustration. She had never been in this position before. She had never had to fight so hard just to survive. But she was still alive, and that thought fueled her determination. There had to be a way out of this pit. There had to be a way to regain control. She was a predator, not some animal trapped like prey. She would find a way out, and when she did, she would make him pay for this humiliation. She began to assess her surroundings. The pit was deep, but not so deep that she couldn't see the sky. Through the opening above, the walls was slick with mud, but there were small rocks and roots sticking out in places. Perhaps she could use them to climb, or at least create leverage. The human had made this trap to contain her, but he had underestimated her resourcefulness. With a grunt of effort, she pushed herself to her feet and began to examine the walls of the pit. Her fingers brushed the rough surface of the earth. As she looked for a foothold or handhold, the mud made it slippery, but she could feel the edges of rocks jutting out and small roots that had twisted into the soil. Her sharp senses guided her as she focused on every detail. She had to move quickly before the human came back to finish her off. Minutes passed as she worked with determination, using every muscle in her body to find a way up the pit, each movement precise, and calculated her fingers, scraping against the hard surface of the earth. But she knew she was getting closer. The walls weren't impossible to climb, just challenging. But the real challenge would be the moment she reached the top. That's when the human would be waiting, ready to finish what he had started. The game had changed the moment she had fallen into this trap, and now the stakes were higher than ever. Finally, she found a strong root that she could grab hold of, and with a mighty heave, she pulled herself up inch by inch, the strain on her body intense. But her was stronger than any fatigue she had felt before. She climbed higher, her body moving with the precision and grace of a predator that had been through countless battles and emerged victorious. Each step took her closer to freedom, but the human had not left the jungle, yet she knew he was still out there watching, waiting for her next move. As she reached the edge of the pit, her fingers brushed the opening, and she pulled herself up and out of the trap, her body trembling with exhaustion. But she was free. She stood on the solid ground once more and looked around the jungle, her sharp eyes scanning for any sign of movement. She was back in control for the moment, but she knew it wouldn't last long. The human would not let her off so easily. He would be hunting her again, and this time she would be ready. The jungle was eerily quiet. As she crouched low, her senses on high alert, she could hear the faintest rustle of leaves and the soft crunch of twigs breaking underfoot. He was nearby. She could feel it. The human was close, but she could not see him. She moved forward, cautiously, her body poised like a coiled spring, ready to strike. But still he remained hidden. She knew he was out there somewhere, watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But this time, she would be prepared. She would not make the same mistakes again. She moved through the jungle silently, her steps light, as she navigated the terrain, her body still burning from the climb, but her mind sharp and focused. She had underestimated him before, but she would not make that mistake again. She had learned from her failure, and now she would use that knowledge to her advantage. She would be the hunter once more. The Huntress continued through the jungle, her every sense attuned to the sounds of the wild, but still there was no sign of her prey, no sign of movement ahead. The silence was oppressive, the tension in the air thickening with every step she took. But she refused to let her guard down. She could feel the human's presence, lurking just beyond her reach. But she was patient. She would not let him get away again. She would find him, and when she did, she would finish this hunt once and for all. The Huntress moved deeper into the jungle, each step calculated, but her mind remained clouded with a growing frustration. She had lost sight of her prey again. Her senses screamed that he was near, but he was slipping through her grasp like smoke. The human was elusive, far more so than she had ever anticipated. Every trail she found seemed to be a trick, another diversion, another false lead designed to keep her chasing shadows. Her muscles burned from the climb, her body drained from hours of tracking, and yet the hunger to finish this hunt was more intense than ever. She had been made a fool once before, and she refused to allow it again. This human had turned the tables in a way she had never experienced. The pride that had fueled her every step in the beginning was now a distant memory, replaced with a fierce determination to reclaim control. The jungle had become a labyrinth, the paths twisted and hidden beneath layers of vines and dense undergrowth, every sound a potential distraction, every movement a threat. She knew that the human was using the environment against her, but what terrified her most was how quickly he had adapted, how quickly he had learned to move like the creatures of the jungle, as if he had become one with it. She couldn't help but admire him despite her anger. He was the perfect prey, but now he was proving to be the perfect hunter. The air was thick with humidity and the sounds of distant creatures, but everything felt muted as her focus honed in on the faintest traces of his scent. She paused, listening intently, every fiber of her being on edge. The jungle was quiet, too quiet. Her instincts were screaming that something was wrong, Yet she couldn't put a finger on it. It was as if the human was no longer just hiding, he was drawing her and leading her deeper into the heart of the jungle. She followed the faintest trail of footprints etched into the soft earth, her sharp eyes picking out every detail. She could feel him just ahead of her. His scent was fresher now. She was getting closer. She could sense it. Her breath quickened as her heart began to race, the anticipation almost unbearable. He had been toying with her for days. But now the chase was nearing its end. She would find him soon. She would claim her victory. The Huntress moved forward, her body tense, every nerve alive. She had learned to move through the jungle as one with it, but she was still vulnerable. She knew that the human had already set traps in the past, and that same trap could be waiting for her again. She could feel it like a shadow following her every step. The jungle seemed to shift around her, the very ground beneath her feet seeming to tremble with the weight of her pursuit. A sudden sound broke through the tension, the faintest crack of a branch snapping in the distance. She froze, her eyes darting around her head, snapping from one side to the other. He was close. She could feel him, her muscles coiled with anticipation, ready to spring into action at the slightest movement. She waited for the sound to come again, the soft rustle of leaves, the quiet breathing of a hunter in hiding. But it never came. Instead, she felt the shift in the air. Just as it had happened before, the subtle change that told her she was not alone. She spun quickly, every sense on high alert. But once again the jungle lay still, no movement, no sound, just the heavy silence pressing down on her as her heart beat louder in her chest. It was almost maddening the way the human was drawing her out, playing with her patience. The Huntress gritted her teeth as she crouched lower into the underbrush. The jungle had become a living thing, wrapping around her, each tree a sentinel, each leaf a warning. The human was a part of it now, just as much as she had been, but his presence was everywhere, and nowhere at once. She was being hunted, and she was being led deeper into the heart of the unknown. Her mind raced, calculating her next move. She needed to be smarter than she had been before. She couldn't let him outwit her again. She had to outlast him to turn the tables back in her favor. But there was no time to waste. Every second felt like an eternity, her every movement carefully chosen. But the jungle was closing in around her, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her as the human scent continued to pull her forward, despite her better judgment, despite the unease building in her chest. The human had become an enigma, a puzzle with pieces that did not fit, and the more she chased, the more the pieces slipped away from her grasp. With each false lead, each trap she narrowly avoided, her certainty in herself started to crack ever so slightly. She had always been the predator, always the one in control, but now she was unsure of everything around her, unsure of what was real and what was another game crafted by the human to keep her guessing. The Huntress stopped again, her sharp senses alert to every shift in the air, the subtle rustling of leaves ahead of her, a sign of movement. And then, without warning, something rushed at her from the side, a sharp pain erupting along her arm as a dart embedded itself into her flesh. The poison worked quickly, her vision blurring as she fell to her knees, the jungle spinning around her, her breath shallow and ragged as she tried to fight the effects of the toxin flooding her system. She had been caught again. This time, she would have to survive the poison first before she could finish the hunt. The Huntress's body trembled as the poison coursed through her veins, her vision blurred as the world spun around her. But she refused to succumb. She had been poisoned before, and she knew how to fight it. The burning pain in her arm was only temporary. She could feel the toxin working to slow her movements. But she had trained for this moment, trained to withstand pain and exhaustion, to push through when everything inside her screamed for her to stop. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she pushed herself back to her feet, the world tilting dangerously, but her focus never wavered. She had faced greater challenges than this, and she would survive this too. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the antidote pouch hidden beneath her armor, her movements sluggish, but determined. With one swift motion, she retrieved the small vial and uncorked it before bringing it to her lips. The bitter liquid burned as it slid down her throat, but it began to work almost instantly, the dizziness easing, the pain in her arm dulling as the poison began to lose its grip on her body. She stood there for a moment, letting the antidote work its magic, her heart pounding in her chest as she regained her composure. But even as the effects of the poison faded, she knew the real danger was far from over. The human had outsmarted her once again, And this time the game had changed, no longer just a battle of strength and endurance. Now it was a battle of wits and deception. He had forced her into a vulnerable position, and she could feel the sting of it deep inside her. Pride and confidence had been shattered, but she would not let him see that she would rise from this defeat and come back stronger. Her senses sharpened once more as the poison finally cleared from her system, the dizziness completely gone, and her muscles awake and ready. She scanned the jungle once again, listening for the faintest sounds of movement, feeling the air shift as the human's presence lingered somewhere in the distance, his scent faint but unmistakable. He was still near, and she knew that this would be the moment when everything would come to a head. The hunt was almost over. One way or another she would find him. The jungle felt quieter now. The hum of distant creatures seemed to fade into the background as she stalked forward, each step slower, more calculated. The silence was deafening, and she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, every nerve on edge as she searched for any sign of her prey. She knew he was watching her, he always was, but now she had to be smarter. She couldn't afford to make another mistake. The Huntress moved carefully through the underbrush, her eyes scanning the trees, her ears tuned to every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves. She knew that every move she made would be watched, and if she wasn't careful, she would fall into another trap. She had to outthink him. She had to anticipate his moves before he made them. But as the moments stretched on and the silence persisted, she began to feel a growing sense of unease. The jungle seemed too still, too quiet. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, almost as if they were all holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. She could feel the tension building in the air. Something was wrong, something was different. And the more she searched, the more she realized the truth. The human wasn't just hiding anymore. He was waiting for her to make the first move. Her heartbeat quickened as she moved deeper into the jungle, the oppressive quiet wrapping around her as she continued to scan the trees. But no matter how hard she looked, there was no sign of him. It was as if he had become part of the jungle itself, blending into the shadows and the leaves, his presence all around her, but never visible, never tangible. The Huntress felt a shift in the air, a sudden rush of movement to her left, and before she could react, she felt the sharp sting of another dart piercing her side. She gasped in shock as the poison began to spread through her once again, but this time she was ready, her body already working to fight the effects. As she quickly reached for the antidote vial, she had learned her lesson the first time, and she wasn't about to let the human get the better of her again. The antidote burned as it slid down her throat, and she could feel the poison's grip loosening. But she knew she had no time to waste. She had been hit again, and she was losing precious moments. Her vision wavered for a moment as she struggled to regain her bearings, but she forced herself to stay focused. She could hear his footsteps, now the soft crunch of leaves underfoot, the faintest breath carried on the wind. He was close. She could feel in her instincts telling her that the human was preparing for his final strike. She had been caught in his trap again, and now it was time for her to make her move. She gritted her teeth and moved forward, her steps slower now, but more deliberate, each movement a calculated risk. She could hear him in the distance, his presence drawing closer, the air crackling with the tension of the impending confrontation. She could sense a shift in the jungle around her as she prepared to face her opponent one last time. She would not be the prey any longer. No matter what it took, she would win this hunt. The Huntress felt the weight of the jungle pressing down on her, her breath steady as she moved with calculated precision, each step careful, each muscle tensed in anticipation, the poison still working through her system. But her body now accustomed to its effects, she could feel the human drawing nearer, his presence, an electric charge in the air. She could sense his every movement, even as he tried to stay hidden. The hunt had shifted again. No longer was she the one in pursuit now, it was him who would have to face her. She pushed forward, the jungle seeming to come alive around her, every leaf rustling a signal, every snap of a twig a warning. But still there was no sign of the human, not yet. She moved slowly through the dense undergrowth, each rustle of the trees a new source of tension. She had learned long ago to be patient, but her patience was wearing thin. She was tired of this game, tired of being toyed with. She had to end it now. She could feel the rage building inside her, threatening to break free. Her mind raced as she pushed aside the branches, her eyes darting from one shadow to the next, each one potentially hiding her prey. The longer she waited, the more likely he was to strike first, the more time he had to set another trap or plan another diversion. But this time she was ready. She wouldn't fall into his games again, no matter what he had planned. The jungle seemed to hold its breath as she moved deeper, her senses sharper now. Every sound amplified, every shift in the air felt like an attack. She had to trust her instincts. They had guided her through countless hunts. But this one felt different. The human was unlike any prey she had ever encountered. He was clever, resourceful, and relentless. And in this moment, she realized just how far he had pushed her, how much he had forced her to adapt, how much she had learned from him. The thought hit her with a strange mix of awe and frustration, but she couldn't afford to dwell on it now. She had to focus. She had to find him before he found her first. Suddenly, she heard a faint rustle to her left, her body reacting before her mind could even process the sound. Her arms shot out, grabbing a thick branch and pulling herself behind it. Just as she felt the sharp sting of another dart whistle past her ear, the human was closer than she had ever imagined. But she was prepared this time. Her hand flew to her side, grabbing a throwing knife, and with a swift motion, she threw it toward the sound, the blade slicing through the air with deadly accuracy. There was a loud thud and a grunt of pain as the knife found its mark. She had hit him, but she didn't waste time celebrating. Her heart hammered in her chest as she heard the human fall to the ground. The dart he had thrown skittering harmlessly to the side. She moved in quickly, her body moving like a shadow through the trees, her every movement practiced and fluid as she closed the distance between them. But as she reached the spot where the human had fallen, she froze, her eyes scanning the ground, the dart still lying there untouched, her breath caught in her throat as she realized what had happened. He was gone. The human had vanished into the jungle once again, leaving behind only the traces of his presence, but no sign of his body, no hint of where he had gone. She cursed under her breath, frustration building within her as she scanned the jungle around her, the silence stretching on with every passing second. The human had outwitted her again. He was always one step ahead, always vanishing. Just when she thought she had him cornered, the jungle had become his ally, and in this moment she realized just how much she had underestimated him.